Hello everyone. Welcome to Story Hub channel. Discover real stories of wife betrayals, shocking twists and turns and their secrets. Hit the subscribe button and get to our story. The sun had just dipped beneath the horizon, painting the evening sky with a warm, amber hue that settled over the neighborhood barbecue. The sound of kids squealing as they played tag filled the air, mingling with the heavy scent of grilled meat. I took a sip of my wine, my eyes wandering across the backyard to where my husband, Jason, stood chatting with a group of guys. "Oh, fantastic," I muttered internally, recognizing the raucous laughter. Kevin, Scott, and Tony, Jason's old college buddies. They called themselves the Three Musketeers, though I always thought the Three Stooges was a more fitting title. I strolled over, a mix of curiosity and slight irritation bubbling up inside me. It was hard to ignore the way their eyes lingered on me, but I brushed it off. I wasn't dressed to turn heads, just a simple sundress and sandals, but apparently that was enough for them to take notice. Men, I thought, rolling my eyes in my head. "Hey Liz, you remember Kevin, Scott, and Tony?" Jason gestured towards them with a beer in hand. I nodded, offering a polite smile. They smiled back, but there was something in their gaze that made my skin crawl. "Hey Liz, it's been a while," Kevin said, his grin a little too predatory. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered just a moment too long. "Yeah, it has," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. My stomach fluttered uneasily, a feeling I quickly tried to suppress. Just some harmless chatter, right? As the evening wore on, the drinks started flowing more freely, and the conversations grew louder and more animated. I soon found myself in a small group with Kevin and Scott, both of them leaning in just a little closer than necessary. "You're looking really good, Liz," Kevin said, his voice smooth, almost like velvet. My cheeks warmed, not from the compliment itself, but from the way it made me feel, uneasy, with a flicker of something else I didn't want to acknowledge. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound indifferent. My mind was racing, battling the unwelcome thrill his attention stirred up. After all, I was a married woman, for crying out loud. As the evening dragged on, I decided it was time for another drink. The kitchen felt like a safe haven, a brief escape from the increasingly flirtatious banter. But as I poured myself a glass of wine, Kevin appeared in the doorway, his presence suddenly making the room feel a lot smaller. "You know, Liz," he began, stepping closer, his voice low and suggestive, "I've always thought you were the most interesting one in the group." My heart skipped a beat as a wave of excitement mixed with guilt washed over me. This couldn't be happening. I needed to leave, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. Before I could find the words to respond, Scott joined us, his grin as wide as ever. "Kevin, don't hog all the charm. Leave some for the rest of us." I laughed nervously, feeling the walls start to close in. "Guys, I really think I should get back." Before I could finish, Tony entered the room, his straightforwardness adding a new layer of tension. "What's going on here? You guys giving Liz a hard time?" "Just having a bit of fun," Scott answered, his tone light, but with an edge. My heart raced as they closed in around me, their words playful but laced with something unsettling. I felt like a deer in the headlights, frozen, unsure how to break free without causing a scene. And then, as if completely unaware of the storm brewing around me, Jason walked in. "Hey, what are you guys up to?" he asked, his tone easygoing. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The guys immediately stepped back, their attitudes transforming into a show of harmless camaraderie, but the tension hung heavy in the air, making it hard to breathe. "Just chatting," Kevin said smoothly, giving Jason a friendly clap on the shoulder. I forced a smile, doing my best to hide the storm of emotions swirling inside me. For the rest of the evening, I stuck close to Jason, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I wanted to brush off the whole thing, to convince myself it was nothing, but Kevin's lingering touch and those suggestive glances were seared into my memory. As the barbecue wound down, the events of the night weighed on me like a dark cloud. My emotions were a jumbled mess of guilt, excitement, and confusion. I knew I should talk to Jason, but what could I even say? "Hey honey, your friends are giving me the creeps." Yeah, that would go over well, so instead, I just pushed the thoughts aside, determined to forget as we headed home. But deep down, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. When Monday rolled around, I was deep in the monotony of work emails when my phone buzzed, snapping me out of it. I glanced at the screen and saw a message notification from an unexpected sender, Kevin. My heart did a little flip. Of course it did. "Hey Liz, hope you had fun at the barbecue. We're planning a night out this Friday. Would love for you to join us. What do you say?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. A swirl of emotions churned inside me. Curiosity, unease, and that pesky thrill I knew I shouldn't be feeling. This was a terrible idea. I knew that much. But really, what harm could come from a night out? They were Jason's friends, after all. It had to be innocent fun, right? "Sure, sounds good," I typed back, hitting send before I could talk myself out of it. Friday came around too quickly, bringing with it a rising tide of guilt. Jason and I were sitting in the living room, his voice a distant murmur as he talked about his day, while my thoughts were a million miles away. "So, what's the plan for tonight?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard with his interest. "Oh, just meeting up with some of your old friends. They invited me out," I replied, hoping I sounded casual. Jason grinned. "That's awesome. I'm glad you're getting along with them. They're a blast." "Yeah, a blast," I echoed, forcing a smile. My stomach churned with unease. I hated keeping things from him, but how could I explain the undercurrent of tension that lingered in all my interactions with his friends? The bar was dimly lit, the air filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. As I walked in, my pulse quickened when I spotted Kevin, Scott, and Tony at a table near the back. They waved me over, their smiles wide and welcoming, maybe a bit too welcoming. "Liz, glad you could join us," Kevin said, sliding a drink my way as soon as I sat down. "Thanks," I muttered, taking a sip. I could feel their eyes on me, a prickling awareness that made me both self-conscious and oddly exhilarated. Was this what it felt like to be a mouse under the watchful eyes of three cats? As the night went on, the drinks kept coming, and the banter grew more and more suggestive. I found myself leaning into it, laughing a little too loudly, responding a little too flirtatiously. It was like watching myself from the outside. Who was this woman, and why was she flirting with danger? "Let's get out of here," Kevin suggested at one point, his voice low and smooth. "I know a quieter place where we can really talk." My heart pounded hard in my chest. This was it, the moment where I should put my foot down, draw a clear line, but instead, I found myself nodding, my body moving as if on autopilot. We all piled into a cab, the air around us thick with a mix of anticipation and tension. The cab came to a stop in front of a secluded house on the outskirts of town. My nerves were buzzing as we walked inside, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken possibilities. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath me slowly crumbling away. In the dim light of the living room, Kevin leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "You know, Liz, we've always had a bit of a wild streak. Are you open to trying something unconventional?" My mind spun. Was he really suggesting what I thought he was? Shock mixed with a strange allure, the forbidden nature of his words tugging at something deep within me. I wanted to run, to laugh, to cry. But more than anything, I wanted to know what would happen if I stayed. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of the moment pressing down. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, watching. The tension was so thick, it felt like an electric current humming in the air. Right then, I realized I was standing at a crossroads, one path leading back to the safety of my old life, the other into uncharted territory. I wasn't sure which way I'd turn, only that whatever choice I made would change everything. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. I stood there in the living room, the weight of the evening bearing down on me. Kevin's words lingered in the air like a forbidden promise, their implications making my pulse race. "Why don't we get comfortable?" Kevin suggested, his voice soft but with a hint of command. I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This was wrong on so many levels, yet the intensity of the moment was intoxicating, pulling me in despite the alarms blaring in my head. Kevin stepped closer, his fingers lightly brushing against my arm. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me. "You can trust us, Liz. We're just here to have a good time." Trust. That was a loaded word. But here I was, standing in this dimly lit room with three men who weren't my husband, on the brink of a decision that could shatter my world. Before I could fully process what was happening, Scott joined us. His touch was bolder, more assertive. He ran his hand down my back, sending shivers up my spine. "You look tense," he murmured. "Relax. We're all friends here." Friends, sure. I felt my resolve slipping away. The mix of fear and arousal was overwhelming, clouding my judgment. I found myself leaning into Scott's touch, a part of me desperate for the release that seemed just out of reach. The room seemed to grow even darker as Tony entered, his presence completing the trio. His gaze was intense, his intentions unmistakable. The way they all looked at me, like predators circling their prey, made my heart race even faster. "Liz," Kevin whispered, his lips dangerously close to my ear. "Just let go. Just for tonight." His words echoed through me, breaking down the last of my resistance. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the wave of desire that washed over me. It was a heady mix of fear and exhilaration, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Just as I started to lose myself in the moment, the front door creaked open. My eyes snapped wide, my breath catching in my throat as I saw Jason standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of shock and hurt, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, it felt like time froze. The silence was so thick it was suffocating. Then, without a word, Jason stepped back, retreating into the shadows. The pain in his eyes was etched into my memory, a brutal reminder of the consequences of my actions. But Kevin, Scott, and Tony didn't seem to care. They moved in closer, their touches growing more demanding. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, shame, guilt, and a dark, forbidden desire that refused to be ignored. As the night wore on, we indulged in a twisted dance of passion. Each of Jason's friends took their turn with me, pushing me to the edge of my limits with their relentless advances. My mind was a blur of sensations, each touch lighting a fire inside me that I couldn't put out. And all the while, Jason watched from a distance, his presence a silent reminder of the betrayal I was committing. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, adding an intense layer to an already overwhelming experience. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I was utterly spent. The room was filled with the aftermath of what we'd done, a chaotic mess of bodies and emotions. I lay there staring blankly at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of regret and satisfaction. Jason's departure was silent, like a ghost slipping out of the house without a sound. The pain in his eyes haunted me, a stark contrast to the twisted pleasure I had just experienced. As the sun rose, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The night had upended my world, and there was no going back. I was trapped in the consequences of my choices, my heart and mind forever altered by what had happened. There was no clean ending, no way to neatly wrap up the events of the night. All that remained was the raw, unfiltered reality of what I had done, and the knowledge that I would have to face the fallout, one way or another. I woke up to the unforgiving glare of the morning sun streaming through the window. My head throbbed, and as the fog of sleep lifted, memories from the previous night crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was alone, tangled in the sheets, my body aching in ways that brought both shame and a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Great, just what I needed," I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. Regret, confusion, and that damn exhilarating thrill all churned in my gut. What the hell had I done? The house was eerily silent, amplifying the guilt gnawing at me. Jason. The image of his face, that raw hurt in his eyes, stabbed at my conscience. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself out of bed and into the shower, hoping the hot water could wash away some of the grime clinging to my soul. Downstairs, Jason was waiting. His coffee cup sat untouched on the kitchen table, steam curling up into the air like a silent accusation. He looked up as I entered, his eyes hard, his mouth set in a grim line. "Liz," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk about last night." I felt the floor drop out from under me. There was no escaping this. "Jason, what the hell happened?" His voice cut through the air like a whip, stopping me cold. I took a shaky breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "I don't know how to explain it," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was curious and things got out of control. I'm so sorry." "Curious?" he echoed. Disbelief and anger laced through his words. "Curious about what, Liz?" sleeping with my friends. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I wanted to disappear, to crawl into a hole and never come out. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I didn't plan for any of this. It just happened. Jason shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Just happened, that's rich. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, my heart sinking as I saw the notifications. Messages from Kevin, Scott, and Tony. Each one was a mix of regret and desire, their words pulling at me even now. We need to talk. Last night was incredible, but we need to figure this out. Liz, I'm sorry if we pushed you too far. Let's meet and talk about it. Hey, can't stop thinking about you. We need to continue what we started. I quickly turned the phone over, feeling Jason's eyes burning into me. They're reaching out to you, aren't they? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Yes, they're sorry, but they also want to keep seeing me. He slammed his fist on the table, making me jump. And what do you want, Liz? Do you even know anymore? My throat tightened. I don't know, I'm so confused. I hate what I did to you. But part of me is drawn to them. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and pretense. I tried to dodge Kevin and his friends, but they were relentless. Texts, calls, even showing up at places I frequented. It felt like they were everywhere, and Jason's growing suspicion only made things worse. I found myself neglecting my usual routines, consumed by thoughts of the trio and the illicit thrill they offered. My work suffered, my friendships grew strained, and all the while Jason watched me with narrowed eyes, his trust eroding with each passing day. One evening, as I came home late yet again, Jason was waiting for me, his patience clearly worn thin. Where have you been? He demanded, his tone icy. Out, I replied, too tired to offer a better excuse. Out where? With them? His voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. I threw my bag on the couch, frustration boiling over. Why does it matter? You don't trust me anyway. Because you're giving me every reason not to, he shot back. You're out all the time, you're distant, and you're lying to me, Liz. I can see it. We stood there, locked in a heated standoff. My mind screamed at me to confess, to come clean and beg for forgiveness, but my heart, twisted and confused, kept me silent. You know what? Jason finally said, his voice breaking. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. You need to decide what you want because this isn't working. With that, he walked out, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room, trapped by my own actions and desires. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, and I knew that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. I woke up every morning with a pit in my stomach, an uncomfortable mix of dread and longing. My life had become a minefield, each step threatening to blow everything apart. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my untouched breakfast, the events of the past weeks a whirlwind I couldn't escape. Kevin, Scott, and Tony had become more insistent, their texts and calls constant reminders of the nights I both regretted and craved. They pushed my boundaries further each time, making it harder for me to resist the dark pull they exerted on my life. Her phone buzzed, and she didn't need to glance at it to know who it was. The thrill of the forbidden still pulsed through her veins, but now it was tainted with a constant sense of impending doom. Hey, beautiful, can't stop thinking about you. Tonight? Kevin's message read. She swallowed hard, her finger hovering over the screen. Her body betrayed her, aching to say yes even as her mind screamed no. Jason's suspicion had reached an all-time high. He watched her every move, his trust whittled down to nothing. One evening, he finally found the proof he'd been searching for. Liz was in the shower when he heard her phone buzz on the bedside table. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for confirmation, got the better of him. He picked up the phone, his eyes widening as he read the damning messages. Thinking about last night. Can't wait to see you again. Let's take things further next time. Jason's world shattered in that instant. He put the phone down, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone clenched in his hand. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice thick with betrayal. I felt my heart stop. Jason, don't even try to explain. He cut me off, his eyes blazing with hurt. I want to hear you say it. Are you having an affair with my friends? My mouth went dry, the room spinning around me. Yes, I whispered, the word dropping like a stone into the chasm between us. The argument that followed was a storm of raw emotions, a torrent of pent-up pain finally unleashed. Jason yelled, I cried, accusations and apologies clashing together in a chaotic symphony of agony. Our marriage, once a sturdy ship, was now a wreckage adrift in a relentless storm. Even as Jason struggled to come to terms with the betrayal, Kevin and his friends refused to back off. They only intensified their pursuit, their messages growing bolder, their calls more frequent. I felt like a puppet, my strings pulled in every direction, unable to find any solid ground. My friends and family began to notice the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the constant tension, but they remained oblivious to the details, and I couldn't bring myself to confide in them. How could I possibly explain the mess I'd made of my life? Isolation wrapped around me like a shroud. I avoided social gatherings, declined invitations, and stopped opening up to my closest friends. The walls were closing in and I was suffocating under the weight of my secrets. In a desperate attempt to regain some control, I tried to end the affair. I texted Kevin, telling him it was over. I ignored their calls, deleted their messages. But Kevin and his friends were relentless, their lure impossible to resist. They knew exactly how to find my weak spots, how to draw me back into their world despite the guilt and shame gnawing at me. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. Jason confronted Kevin and his friends at a local bar, his anger barely contained. "Stay away from my wife," he demanded, his voice tight with fury. Kevin leaned back, a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "She's not exactly unwilling, Jason. Maybe you should ask her what she really wants." Standing on the sidelines, I felt my world start to tilt. The confrontation was a collision of the two lives I'd been juggling, the facade I'd built threatening to crumble completely. I watched as Jason's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white with barely suppressed rage. "You've done enough damage," Jason said through gritted teeth. "This ends now." Kevin's smile faded, replaced by a steely determination. "That's up to Liz, isn't it?" The bar seemed to shrink around us, the air heavy with unspoken threats. My heart pounded, knowing I had to make a choice but feeling utterly lost, unable to see a clear path forward. My double life was unraveling, each thread tightening around me, trapping me in a web of my own making. My life had become a dizzying carousel of guilt, desire, and regret, spinning so fast I couldn't find my footing. The confrontation at the bar had been the tipping point, leaving me suspended in a limbo where every decision felt like a betrayal of someone. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall, John's ultimatum echoing in my mind. "You need to decide, Liz. It's them or me. This can't go on." His words had cut through the fog of my confusion like a knife. I knew he was right. The double life I was leading was unsustainable, but every time I tried to picture a future without Kevin and his friends, a gnawing emptiness opened up inside me. Kevin's texts had become relentless, his tone more insistent, almost possessive. "Can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk." Scott and Tony weren't far behind, their messages equally intense, their presence a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. My heart ached under the weight of my choices. The connection I felt with Kevin and his friends was undeniable, a magnetic pull I couldn't explain. They saw me, wanted me, in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. But then there was Jason, the man I had built a life with, now slipping through my fingers like sand. One evening, the pressure became too much. I found myself standing in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. The emotional whirlwind inside me was tearing me apart, and I could feel myself unraveling. I looked up, and there was Jason, watching me with a mix of hope and despair. "Have you made your decision?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tears welled up in my eyes. "Jason, I don't—" He cut in, his face hardening. "Don't make excuses. Just tell me." I felt the dam inside me break. "I don't know what to do," I confessed, my voice cracking. "I'm so confused. I hate what this is doing to us, but I can't seem to stop." Jason's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and pain. "Then you're making the decision for us," he said, turning away. "I can't keep living like this, Liz. Either you end it, or we're done. Kevin and his friends sensed my vulnerability, their pursuit growing more intense. They knew I was on the edge, and they played into it, their attention a heady drug I couldn't resist. I found myself drawn to them, unable to pull away even as my marriage crumbled around me. My friends and family noticed my distress, but I kept them at arm's length. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain the mess I'd made of my life? So I withdrew, isolating myself further, trapped in the web of my own making. Then came the night when everything shattered. I had agreed to meet Kevin, hoping to find some clarity, some way to make sense of my tangled emotions. We were at his place, the tension thick in the air. I was about to speak when the door burst open, and there stood Jason, his face a mask of fury and heartbreak. "You!" Jason spat, glaring at Kevin. "Get away from my wife!" Kevin held his ground, his eyes locked onto Jason's. "She came to me, Jason. Maybe you should ask yourself why." The room exploded into chaos, with Jason's voice rising in fury, and Kevin's in defiance. I stood between them, my heart racing as the full weight of my actions came crashing down on me. The confrontation was brutal, emotions running wild, and by the time it was over, I felt like I had been torn in two. Jason turned to me, his face a mix of sorrow and resolve. "I can't do this anymore, Liz. I want a divorce." The word struck me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for breath. I watched as Jason walked away, the finality of his decision settling over me like a heavy shroud. My life was in ruins, and I had no one to blame but myself. As I sat amidst the wreckage of my choices, I felt the crushing weight of what I had done pressing down on me. I was torn between the love I had lost and the desire that had consumed me, and I knew that whichever path I chose, nothing would ever be the same again. My life had become a relentless storm, each wave of emotion more violent than the last. The divorce papers sat unsigned on the dining table, a constant reminder of my crumbling world. The pull of Kevin and his friends was stronger than ever, even as I recognized the chaos they had brought into my life. Kevin's messages had taken on a desperate tone. "We need to talk. You can't just walk away from this." I sighed, rubbing my temples. I felt trapped, like a fly caught in a web, the strands tightening around me with every move. I isolated myself more and more, my friends and family noticing my distress, but unaware of the dark undercurrents dragging me under. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain the tangled mess of desire and guilt? One night, Kevin and his friends pushed harder. "Meet us tonight. There's something we need to settle. Don't make us come to you." The location they suggested was remote, far from the prying eyes of the city. My better judgment screamed at me to ignore them, to cut ties and run, but the powerful mix of fear and anticipation drove me to agree. I needed closure, or maybe I just needed to feel something, anything, in the numb void my life had become. The place was as desolate as I imagined, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, its silhouette stark against the night sky. As I approached, my heart pounded in my chest, each step heavy with trepidation. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Kevin, Scott, and Tony were waiting, their expressions a mix of determination and something darker. "You came," Kevin said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. I stood my ground, my nerves frayed. "What do you want from me?" "Everything," Kevin replied, stepping closer. "We want you to submit completely. No more games." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew they were pushing my boundaries, demanding more than I was willing to give. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing against me as the tension mounted. A noise outside caught my attention. The door burst open, and there stood Jason, his face a mask of horror and helplessness. He had tracked my movements, unable to let go despite everything. "Liz, what are you doing?" Jason's voice was strained, filled with a mix of anger and desperation. The room erupted into chaos. Kevin and his friends turned on Jason, their dominance threatened by his sudden appearance. "This is none of your business," Kevin snarled, stepping toward him. Jason's fists clenched. "She's my wife. This ends now." The confrontation quickly escalated. Jason lunged at Kevin, his fury spilling over. Scott and Tony retaliated, and the room descended into a violent melee. I watched, frozen in place, as the men grappled with each other, the air thick with shouts and grunts of pain. Amid the chaos, my emotions reached a breaking point. I was torn between the urge to escape and the twisted allure that had drawn me into this in the first place. The power struggle swirled around me, each side pulling me in different directions. But as the fight raged on, my mind began to clear. I saw the destruction I had caused, the lives I had torn apart. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had to break free. This was not who I wanted to be. With a surge of determination, I stepped forward. "Stop!" My voice cut through the noise, drawing everyone's attention. "This has to end." The men paused, their breath ragged, eyes wide with shock. I turned to Jason, my heart breaking at the sight of his devastated expression. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." Then I faced Kevin, Scott, and Tony. "I can't do this anymore. This, whatever this is, it's destroying me. It's over." Kevin's face twisted with anger, but he said nothing. Scott and Tony exchanged glances, their bravado fading. The tension in the room dissipated, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Jason moved to my side, his touch tentative. "Let's go home," he said softly. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow as we walked out of the warehouse, leaving the chaos behind. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I had made my choice. It was time to face the consequences and rebuild my life piece by piece. My world felt like it had been turned inside out and left to hang, tattered and frayed. The confrontation in the warehouse had been the breaking point, but the aftermath was a slow, agonizing unraveling. With his heart shattered beyond repair, Jason packed his bags and left. The last look he gave me, a mix of betrayal and sorrow, was burned into my memory. I was alone, facing the wreckage of my life. Kevin and his friends, undeterred by the chaos they had caused, continued their pursuit. Messages pinged on my phone, their words a blend of apologies and demands. "We need to talk. You can't just walk away. You belong with us." I felt suffocated, their presence looming over me like a dark cloud I couldn't escape. One evening, I sat in my now empty living room, the silence pressing in on me. I scrolled through the endless messages from Kevin and his friends, my fingers hovering over the delete button. I needed to get them out of my life, but their hold on me was like a vice. My phone buzzed again, and I threw it across the room in frustration. My friends and family, having pieced together fragments of my situation, reached out with concern. They offered support, a lifeline I was hesitant to grab. The shame of my actions, the deceit and betrayal, made me feel unworthy of their help. I isolated myself further, the weight of my decisions crushing my spirit. "Liz, we love you. Please let us help," her best friend Emily pleaded over the phone one night. I wanted to cry, to pour out everything that had been gnawing at me, but the words stuck in my throat. I mumbled something about needing time and hung up, staring blankly at the wall. In a desperate attempt to reclaim my life, I distanced myself from Kevin and his friends. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and avoided the places they frequented. The process of rebuilding my shattered existence was daunting. Each day was a struggle to find a new sense of normalcy, to piece together an identity that wasn't tied to the chaos I'd created. Jason, true to his word, began the process of divorce. The papers arrived in a neat, stark envelope, their contents final and unforgiving. As I signed them, a profound sense of loss and regret washed over me. The life I had known, the love I had taken for granted, was gone. Kevin and his friends, however, were not so easily deterred. They made one final desperate attempt to pull me back, their tactics manipulative and insidious. Flowers appeared at my doorstep, accompanied by notes dripping with false sincerity. "We miss you, Liz. Please, let's talk." I felt the familiar pull, the twisted allure of their attention. But this time, something inside me had shifted. I saw their actions for what they were, a desperate attempt to control me, to keep me ensnared in their toxic web. With a surge of determination, I made my stand. I gathered the courage to face them one last time, to sever the ties completely. Meeting them in a public place, I stood tall, my voice steady. "This ends now. I want nothing more to do with any of you." Kevin's face twisted in anger, but I held my ground. Scott and Tony tried to plead, to charm their way back into my life, but I was resolute. I deserve better than this. I deserve to find myself again. Walking away from them felt like shedding a heavy cloak, the weight lifted, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with self-discovery and healing, but I was ready to face it, to rebuild my life from the ground up. As I stepped into the future, I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be days of doubt, moments of weakness, but I had made my choice. I had chosen myself, and that, I realized, was the first step toward truly living again. I sat on the porch of my new apartment, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The early morning light cast a soft glow on the quiet street below. I found myself reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had led me here to this point of solitude and tentative new beginnings. My life had been a series of chaotic twists, each one pulling me further from the person I once knew. With a wry smile, I thought about the absurdity of it all. How had I, a woman who once prided herself on stability, fallen into such a tangled mess? The memories of Kevin, Scott, and Tony flickered like ghosts, reminders of choices made in moments of weakness and confusion. Guilt gnawed at me, a persistent ache that refused to fade. I had betrayed Jason, a man who had loved me unconditionally, and now he was gone. The loss of our marriage felt like an open wound, raw and unhealed. But amid the guilt and shame, there was also a strange sense of relief. I was free from the web of lies, from the toxic grip of Kevin and his friends. In the quiet of my apartment, I began the slow process of untangling my emotions. I sought the help of a therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ellis. Our sessions became a lifeline, a safe space where I could unpack the emotional and psychological factors that had driven me into the affair. "Why did you seek out these relationships?" Dr. Ellis asked one afternoon, her tone gentle but probing. I sighed, staring at my hands. I don't know. Maybe it was the excitement, the feeling of being wanted. I felt invisible in my marriage. But that's no excuse. I hurt Jason deeply. Dr. Ellis nodded. Understanding your vulnerabilities is the first step toward healing. We all have moments of weakness. What's important is what we learn from them. I spent hours in reflection, examining my actions and their consequences. I began to see patterns, moments where I had let my insecurities dictate my choices. It was a painful process, but also cathartic. I started to understand myself in ways I never had before. Slowly, I reconnected with my friends and family. The initial conversations were awkward, filled with half-explanations and apologies. But to my surprise, they embraced me with open arms, offering support and understanding. Emily, my best friend, became a constant presence, her unconditional love a soothing balm for my wounded heart. "You screwed up," Emily said bluntly one evening, handing me a glass of wine. "But we all do. The important thing is you're trying to make things right." Jason and I had one final confrontation, a meeting that was both painful and necessary. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, the air thick with unresolved tension. "Why, Liz?" Jason asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" I took a deep breath, looking him in the eyes. I was lost, Jason. I didn't know who I was anymore, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I'm sorry for everything. Jason nodded, his expression hardening. I appreciate the apology, but it's too late for us. I need to move on, and so do you. As we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of closure. The future was uncertain, but I was finally free to find myself again. I threw myself into my work, finding solace in the routine and the small victories of my career. Each day was a step toward rebuilding my life, toward reclaiming the person I wanted to be. Kevin and his friends faded into the background, their influence waning as I distanced myself from their toxic grip. There were moments of doubt, times when the shadows of my past threatened to overwhelm me, but with each passing day, those moments grew fewer. I began to see glimpses of hope, of a future that was mine to shape. One sunny afternoon, as I walked through the park, I felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was long and uncertain, but I was ready to face it. I had learned from my mistakes, and I was determined to build a life free from the shadows of my past. For the first time in a long while, I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. The journey was just beginning, but I knew I had the strength to walk it. I had chosen myself, and that made all the difference. The sun streamed through the windows of my new apartment, filling the space with a warm golden light. I stretched lazily, savoring the rare feeling of contentment that had begun to find its way into my mornings. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter, one I had vowed to write with care and purpose. I decided it was time to focus on myself. I set new goals, small but meaningful steps toward rebuilding my sense of self-worth. The first step was self-care. I joined a yoga class, started cooking healthy meals, and even treated myself to a new wardrobe that made me feel confident and beautiful. Each small victory was a building block, reinforcing the foundation of the new life I was creating. Through this journey, I met new people who brought positive influences into my life. There was Claire from yoga, whose infectious enthusiasm for life was a constant source of inspiration, and Daniel, a colleague who became a good friend, and a gentle reminder that not all relationships had to be complicated or toxic. These new, healthy connections helped me heal, showing me that it was possible to be surrounded by love and support without losing myself in the process. One afternoon, while wandering through a local art supply store, I felt a familiar spark. I remembered how much I used to love painting, how it had once been a vital part of my identity. I bought a set of watercolors and some canvases, deciding to reconnect with my passion for art. At first, the brush felt awkward in my hand, the strokes hesitant and unsure. But slowly, as I allowed myself to let go, the colors began to flow. I channeled my emotions into my work, each piece a reflection of my journey. The pain, the growth, the newfound joy. It brought me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years, a reminder that creativity could be a powerful outlet for healing. A few months later, Jason and I met for a final, amicable conversation. We sat in a quiet cafe, the tension that once defined our relationship replaced by mutual respect. We talked about our shared history, the mistakes made, and the lessons learned. "I hope you find happiness, Liz," Jason said, his voice sincere. "Thank you, Jason," I replied, feeling a sense of closure. "I wish the same for you." We parted ways with a handshake and a bittersweet smile, both of us ready to move on to the next chapter of our lives. Inspired by my newfound freedom, I decided to take a solo trip to Italy, a place I had always dreamed of visiting. The journey was liberating, each new experience a step toward reclaiming my sense of self. I wandered through the streets of Florence, marveled at the art in the Uffizi Gallery, and indulged in the simple pleasures of good food and wine. Standing on a hill overlooking the Tuscan countryside, I felt a profound sense of peace and liberation. Back home, I continued to build a life that reflected my true self. I embraced new opportunities and experiences, leaving the shadows of my past behind. I started teaching art classes at a community center, sharing my passion with others, and finding joy in their creative discoveries. One evening, I stood in my new home, surrounded by my paintings and the life I had rebuilt. The walls were adorned with vibrant colors, each piece a testament to my resilience and strength. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace I had thought lost forever. I knew that life would always have its challenges, but I was ready to face them. I had learned to embrace my imperfections, to find beauty in the journey rather than the destination. With a smile, I picked up my paintbrush, ready to add more colors to the canvas of my life. I was free, I was strong, and I was finally truly myself.